Howdy again everyone. Last year, the Laowa lens company launched their first ever autofocus lens, a pretty ambitious and unbelievably wide 10mm optic for full frame cameras. I tested it and it was pretty good actually. Now they're bringing out a new version of the lens which is very similar, but it has a slightly more sane 12mm focal length. The Laowa 12mm f2.8 Lite Zero-D FF. Fans of ultra-wide-angle lenses tend to be rather insatiable, always wanting wider, but 10mm is actually pretty hard to work with, to be honest, on a full-frame camera. It's so wide that it's hard to compose your images, so having a 12mm lens instead will make things a little easier while still getting that crazy effect. Also, this new lens is slightly smaller and lighter than a 10mm version, and at $699 it'll be a little cheaper than its brother as well. The autofocus version will be available on Sony E and Nikon Z mount cameras, and it has 5 aperture blades to its iris mechanism. The lens will also be available on L-mount and Canon RF-mount cameras, also with 5 aperture blades but manual focus only. And also a separate manual focus version of the lens with 14 iris blades to its aperture mechanism for softer bokeh when stopped down but probably slightly tamer sun stars will be available on all 4 systems, but that version will be manual focus only. So you have a bit of a choice there, and lucky old Sony and Nikon shooters can get hold of an autofocus version here with 5 aperture blades for probably slightly stronger sun stars. Alright, I'd like to thank Laowa for loaning me a copy of this lens for evaluation, although as usual, this is a totally independent review. We'll be looking at both its strengths and its weaknesses. Like its older 10mm brother, the lens has nice metallic build quality and a quite unique aesthetic design, being painted in this very unusual colour, a strange mixture of blue and purple, which I like to call blurple. The rear mount is made of metal with a decent sized weather sealing gasket around it, but I couldn't see a USB port for future firmware updates. Then on the autofocus versions of the lens we get an auto manual focus switch, which is then followed by a broad metallic focus ring which turns extremely smoothly. When changing focus, the lens exhibits notable focus breathing, as you can see, not that that's a major problem on such a wide-angle optic, and here you can see the autofocus at work. It works silently and accurately, and whether you're shooting in autofocus single or continuous mode, it goes very quickly too. Nice! My early production copy of the lens had an issue where the autofocus would lock up occasionally, and I would have to turn the camera off and remove and replace the lens to get it working again. I've been told that this will be fixed for the final production version. The good news is that this lens has a 72mm filter thread. The bad news is that the only 72mm polarizing filter I actually own is rather thick and therefore causes quite strong physical vignetting, as you can see in this image. So try to get the thinnest filters you possibly can. The lens also comes with quite a narrow metallic lens hood. All in all, the build quality is great here, to be honest. If you buy one though, do check that the autofocus is working properly. Alright, let's see about image quality. We'll test it on a full frame camera, the brutal 61MP Sony A7C-R. In-camera corrections are turned on for this test. If you want images zoomed into the 42MP ratio of my older reviews, by the way, for comparison purposes, then you can find a link to a special unlisted video in the description below. At f2.8 in the middle of the image, right away we see fantastic sharpness and contrast. Well, let's look over into the image corners then. A few things jump out right away. There's some corner darkness and chromatic aberration to be clearly seen, but what really jumps out for me more positively is that even on this 61MP camera, corner sharpness is fantastic. It's a big deal that the lens is resolving this much detail from corner to corner, straight from f2.8 on the most demanding full-frame camera currently available. Stop down to f4 and the really eagle-eyed among you will notice just a tiny extra edge of sharpness there, At f5.6 and f8, we finally get just a little extra brightness now, but no other improvements. Stop down to f11 or darker, and you'll start to get softer images due to the softening effect of diffraction. Still, it's a fantastic performance in terms of resolution straight from f2.8, which is the most important thing. After all, that corner darkness and chromatic aberration can be sorted out fairly easily in editing, and the lens is quite a bit sharper in its far edges of its corners than the older 10mm lens, so that's an advantage over the other model. Alright, let's turn off in-camera corrections and take a look at distortion and vignetting. At f2.8, vignetting is heavy, unsurprisingly. Stop down to f4 or f5.6 for only mild improvements, so you'll want to leave your in-camera corrections turned on. The lens does appear to be projecting a little barrel distortion here, but actually that's because I'm focused so closely to the test chart. If I set the lens's focus to infinity as I do here, it straightens out a bit, leaving behind only a small amount of barrel distortion. This lens can focus pretty closely to your subject, down to only 14 centimeters for some nice creative photography. Well, if you can get enough light onto your subject that closely, that is. At f2.8, close-up image quality unfortunately is very badly washed out. f4 looks a little better, but at f5.6, we're suddenly treated to brilliant close-up sharpness. Next, work against bright light. Here is the lens's biggest problem. Unfortunately, it suffers from some pretty serious flaring and some broader glaring when bright lights are on the edge of your image. Stopping down the lens's aperture doesn't really help much here either, so that's a bit of an issue on such a wide-angle optic. While we're working in the dark, let's take a look for coma and sun stars. At f2.8, we do see slight coma wings on bright points of light in the image corners. Stop down to f4 to see those go away. Let's zoom out and look for sun stars then. At only f4, they're beginning to emerge already on the 5-bladed aperture version of the lens. At f5.6, f8, f11 and f16, they gradually become very strong, and at f22 they are huge. The length of their points is a bit uneven. I personally would say that simply makes them look even cooler. Next, bokeh. Even at f2.8, you won't be getting many out-of-focus backgrounds with this lens because, of course, it's so unbelievably wide. When you do, though, those out-of-focus backgrounds look lovely and soft, as you can see. And that's it. The Laowa AF 12mm f2.8 Lite Zero-D. It's a good lens, impressively sharp, with low distortion. Functionally, it works fine, so it could potentially make itself pretty useful for you. Remember though, as I mentioned already, the L-mount and Canon RF-mount versions do not feature autofocus, manual focus only. Be careful of glaring too when shooting with bright lights in the edges of your picture, which is probably this lens's biggest weakness. Oh, and if you use filters with it, make sure they are as thin as possible. Oh, and make sure the autofocus is working properly, of course. I'm sure they will have ironed out any problems by the time final production copies come out, but still, check it anyway. If extreme wideness is what you need, though, then this could be the one for you. While it doesn't go as wide as the older 10mm Laowa lens, this 12mm version is actually sharper in its image corners, so I would prefer this one for stills photography and maybe the 10mm lens for video. It's not bad value for money either, the 12mm lens, so despite having a couple of flaws to be aware of, the lens does still come recommended.